Up Close is presented by Tennova Healthcare, with 6 hospitals and more than 1,000 dedicated physicians. For more information, tennova.com.
Thanks for joining us for Up Close. I'm Stephanie Aldrich. Recently, we marked a milestone that changed America. It's been 50 years since the 1963 March on Washington. It drew a record crowd to our nation's capital and sent a message that people no longer wanted a separate, unequal world. There were the famous names that laid the groundwork for the America we know today, and maybe a not-so-famous one who played a big role in the civil rights movement, and he lives in Knoxville. Reverend Harold Middlebrook had a close friendship with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He even helped organize the March on Washington, participating in sit-ins and getting thrown in jail along the way for the cause. He sat down with us to talk about the struggle for equality and his personal experiences that helped change America half a century ago. Well, tell me about when you first met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when you were a young man as part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
I started out as a student at Morehouse College. We were involved in a group called SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC started out kind of as the youth arm of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. John Lewis and a few others of us and myself, being ministers, young ministers, switched over from SNCC to SCLC. And Dr. King came over to Morehouse to speak to some of the students about nonviolence, love, and how you ensure that you are in a nonviolent campaign.
And that was his message.
Oh, that was his message. And we said to him, Dr. King, you're telling us about how to do it. How about showing us? Come sit in with us. And he did. There were sit-ins that day at Rich's department store in Atlanta and at Davidson's. And both sets got arrested. And we all ended up in jail in Atlanta and in the cell with Dr. King. And so we got a chance to spend a number of days with him. That was really kind of my second exposure. Only I had not personally met him, but as a youngster, we followed the Montgomery bus boycott in my house. My mother and my grandmother and my step-grandfather talked every morning about, so I was exposed to who Martin Luther King was. But it was only in the Atlanta jail that I really got to know him and listen to him every day and every night. I got sick in the jail and developed a real case of pneumonia. And Daddy King bailed me out and took me to A.D.'s house, Martin's brother, where I remained for about a year living in that house with them while I was in school, so that I became a part of the King family.
This wasn't just a relationship, at school or with organizing. I mean, you really got to know him and his family with, this friendship. I
worked with A.D. at his church in Noonan, Georgia, and then came on board at Ebenezer as one of the youth ministers. And so I became a part of, when I was not in A.D.'s house, I was in Daddy King's house. And I became literally a part of the family. Up until his death, Daddy King still called me son. And he came to Knoxville to install me as pastor of the church here when I came in '77.
What do you think made that relationship so tight, besides just obviously the common goals and the struggle for what you were trying to accomplish?
Well, I think a couple of things. Daddy King was really open to young men at Morehouse. He had nurtured a number of young men across the country who had been students at Morehouse. But I think the fact that I actually lived with A.D. And Naomi made me really a closer member of the family. I was around when Christine's, Dr. King's daughter's wedding was being put together, and I saw all of the children born. And in fact, with A.D.'s children, I kind of did the babysitting. So I became a part of the family. Mm-hmm. But I think also our views and our ambitions. I grew up hearing my mother and my grandmother and hearing our minister say that God was going to deliver, that in spite of all that people, African Americans, were going through, and of course then we were Negroes, that we were going through at that time, that God was going to send a deliverer, another Moses. And I just believed that part of my job was to be there to support whoever it was that was about the business of liberation for our people. I grew up seeing a white water fountain and colored water fountain. In Memphis, you were fortunate. We all knew where they were, but most of the stores would only have restrooms that said white women, white men, but there were one or two that would have 3 restrooms, and it would say white women, white men, colored. And so you had to knock on the door to see who was in there and alert somebody to make sure that another sex didn't come in while you were in there. I grew up with all of that. I grew up with when the police pulled up, 2 police officers in a car and 5 or 6 African American men just standing around talking. If the police said scatter, you scattered. I grew up seeing the late Judge Beverly Boucher in Memphis, who most every African American male who came before him got 11 months and 29 days, which means if you didn't have an attorney, a good relations with your boss, you didn't have a job when you got out. And so I just believed that somewhere a part of my calling was to be about the business of helping to liberate. Now that did not mean that I was considered myself a leader. I am a foot soldier.
Well, you say you didn't consider yourself a leader, but what did you see your role as while you were in those college years? What did you see your role?
A good supporter, a good helper. I knew that behind the Sojourner Truths and behind the Harriet Tubmans and the Frederick Douglasses, there were always other people who were there supporting, doing the legwork, doing the kind of work necessary that these individuals could get the recognition. I only saw myself there to make sure that the way was laid. When they needed foot soldiers to go sit in, that was my job. That was my calling. And to make sure that when Martin King or whoever was the leader said, it's rallying time, then my job was to get out and help rally.
Do you remember how you felt before going into that first sit-in that you participated in, being a young man? Were you nervous? Were you on fire?
Well,
were you just ready to go? Do you remember how you felt going into that?
My first sit-in was actually in Memphis as a high school senior, believe it or not. In Memphis, we did not sit in first at lunch counters. We sat in at the library. The people who were doing the sitting in were actually older than I. They were college students at Lemoyne and on campus, and it is only fate, divine providence, that I'm there in the room with them. We don't know to this day who alerted the police, but when the cars dropped us off at the library and pulled off, the paddy wagons were already there waiting on us. And so sitting in Atlanta was not my first episode of sitting in, but it was with a large number of students. Remember, you had all of the students in the Atlanta University system, Clark, Morehouse, Spelman, AU, all of us were involved in the sit-ins together. And so, yeah, it was an exciting time. There was always an excitement and yet an apprehension. The apprehension is because you never knew what you were going to encounter sitting in. You know, we've had coffee poured down our backs. We've had all you knocked off of the stool, and what you got to do is just get back up and get back on it. And so there's always the excitement of what you're about to do. The adrenaline is working, but there's the apprehension that you knew that anything. Not only did you know that other students and other individuals, you were always apprehensive about what the police were going to do, because they were the enforcers of the rigidly held laws that said you can't do this because of your color. Yeah.
And then this became the time, the way you and scores of other people saw it, that this was the time. This was the time to start taking stands and making changes.
Well, you know, Dr. King raised the question several times in speeches. If not now, when? If not you, who? And it just seemed that divine providence had said, it's now. This, you know, when I go back and read the story of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, it was at that moment. I believe it was Heraclitus who said that we stand in a flowing river and we never stand in the same spot twice. So that the problem is, when the opportunity is here, when the vision has come and the time has come, you must be ready to step in at that time and not later. And so 1960 was the time. So many things had happened the years before. You know, back in the 30s, you had attempts by CORE of sit-ins in St. Louis. You had Brown versus Board of Education in 54. You had the Montgomery struggle. You had Emmett Till out of Mississippi, a young man being killed, you know, supposedly for whistling at a white woman when he had a speech impediment and all. And so all of those events brought us to the point that we said, or not we, the Lord said, now is the time. And we were prepared, or not so much prepared, we were available. I tell people all the time, I'm not so sure that any of us are really capable. We have to be available. And the divine equips us to meet the test that we have to meet.
What were those first discussions like when, fast forwarding a little bit, with actually planning a march on Washington? Do you remember how those first started playing out and how that planning process started?
If you remember, A. Philip Randolph, who was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and Martin King had been involved in a march on Washington back in the 50s. Small group compared. But I never shall forget on one occasion, the late James Bevel, who was field director for direct action with SCLC, was on the phone talking to then Attorney General Bobby Kennedy about situations in Gadsden, Alabama, and what had happened in Birmingham and other places. And he said, maybe we need to just put a bunch of these folk bruised and hurt on a bus and bring them up and put them on the lawn of the White House. And then we heard a call from A. Philip Randolph again. And A. Philip Randolph was the respected seer and icon for struggle and liberation at that time, who said that maybe it's time for another march on Washington. And you had meetings of the leaders of SCLC, SNCC Corps, Urban League, who met kind of in ACP on a consistent basis to talk about the struggle. So Randolph persuaded, Martin King and Roy Wilkins and James Farmer and all of them, that now might be the time to start planning for a march on Washington. And they included the Catholic Church and the Jewish community and everybody who believed in liberation and justice and equality.
And the faith groups and the churches became a very intricate part of this planning.
Well, remember the real struggle at that time in the South was based in the church. The struggle was not political. It was a religious movement. It was a movement that says that all men deserve the right to be considered as children of God, as equals. And so the movement itself was church-based. I say to many people that the best time that the church has had since Jesus Christ were the 60s, when the church was out in the street talking to people, talking about their needs, talking about, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he hath called me at this time to preach liberation, to preach justice, to preach release of the captives, to preach the opening of closed eyes. And so the church at that time saw itself in a much different light than the church had seen itself, or that the church sees itself now. Yeah.
And then when the planning process was more, I guess, on a more localized college level, what was your role in that? What were you doing with helping with that planning to plan on this march that everyone was hoping to be big, but wasn't sure, maybe wasn't sure how this was going to just be, how big would it be?
When we got into the march in '63, I had kind of taken a leave from school, working full-time with SCLC. And I was stationed in Danville, Virginia, which had been a very rough place when we had demonstrations there. And we started communicating that the march is going to take place. And so we started communicating with cities all over the South where we knew the march, there had been atrocities, where people were suffering injustice. I don't think any of us thought that we were going to have the numbers. We knew that there were going to be folk who showed up, but nobody thought we were really going to get the numbers until we started hearing that buses were being organized in cities and that people were organizing themselves to come in. Interestingly enough, I was not sure that I was going to make the march. As I said, I was in Danville, Virginia. The day before, the Reverend L.W. Chase, the Reverend Lawrence Campbell, the Reverend H.D. McGehee, and I, 4 ministers in our robes, did a march on the main street in Danville, Virginia. We were sure we were going to be arrested and that the word was going to get to Washington, and that on the way back, people would stop over, hopefully, in Danville and join us. They didn't arrest us. They took our pictures. And so we left after the march, after they didn't arrest us, went on to Washington. Came back 2 days later, and they were waiting on us, locked us up. Virginia being a commonwealth, we were scattered all over the state. And so what we were really trying to do was to say to people everywhere that we came in contact with, now is the opportunity to give some expression to our feelings and to our sufferings, to be able to articulate what it is that we are about by going to Washington, saying to the congressman, and to saying to this new progressive president, now is the time to move. Yeah.
How did you get to the march? Was it a big organized group with your church and those other reverends?
I was not pastoring. I was on staff.
Yeah.
We sent a number of people by bus. Avon Rollins, who lives here in Knoxville, was involved with us in Danville at that time, as was Matthew Jones. And we organized buses of people. I had to fly on to Washington because I stayed to do the demonstration, not sure that I was going to be able to get there. And now that I was able, we flew on there that same afternoon.
You must have been trying to find every which way to make sure you did get there, though. That wasn't
Oh,
something...
of course, the place to be on August 28th was in Washington, D.C. But I had prepared myself that if I got arrested, I would not have gotten there.
That was quite a risk.
Life is full of them. There are opportunities that you have to make an impact and a difference. And so that was, I'm glad I did make it to Washington, of course. I'm glad that I was nearby when Dr. King made his I Have a Dream. Yeah, you do know that that the committee planning, the leadership, the bishops and the rabbis and all of those who were on the committee had to see everybody's speech. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to make sure that the speeches were not too radical. And so I Have a Dream was really not a part of Dr. King's speech. Mm-hmm. But he had delivered that speech at a rally in Detroit. And I never shall forget, as he was seemingly coming to the end of the prepared speech and it was still flat and the crowd was not excited. I remember Mahalia Jackson sitting there saying, I have a dream, Martin, I have a dream. I have a dream. And she had been in Detroit, of course, when he made the I Have a Dream speech. And because the crowd was flat and, nobody, he got into the sync and the rhythm of I Have a Dream, and it electrified the crowd. There were still some people who had been in the planning who said he should not have veered from his prepared speech, but there comes a moment when those of us who are Christian say that the Holy Spirit takes charge. And it was at that moment that he needed to give encouragement and hope and challenge to people to go back to their neighborhoods, to work harder, to bring about justice and equality. One of the things that interests me now is 50 years later, the theme then was jobs, justice, equality. 50 years later, the theme looks like it's going to have to be jobs, justice, and equality. Things change, and yet they remain the same. That the same issues that plagued us 50 years ago are still the issues that are plaguing this country right now. And we're going to have to figure out a way to impact Congress that action must come. One of the things about it is that when people are in power, they don't voluntarily secede their power. It has to be wrestled, or you at least have to make it so uncomfortable for them in the positions that they're in, that they have to make some changes, whether they believe it or not. And we had that problem in '63. We had that problem in '65 with the Voting Rights Act. It was only the march from Selma to Montgomery that changed minds. And so here it is in 13 that we're going to have to say again to the Congress, your responsibility is to represent the people, not to tell the people what they need, but to listen to what the people say they want and to make the changes necessary.
And we will continue our conversation with Reverend Middlebrook next week. We'll talk more in depth about the lengths he actually had to go just to try and get African Americans registered to vote. We'll also talk more about that day in Memphis in 1968 when he witnessed the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was actually among a handful of people in a room who first learned that Dr. King had in fact passed away. Be sure and join us for part 2 of our interview. I'm Stephanie Aldrich, and we'll see you next week for another edition of Up Close.
Up Close is presented by Tennova Healthcare, with 6 hospitals and more than 1,000 dedicated physicians. For more information, tennova.com.